And Secretary of State Marco Rubio speaking out after meeting with G7 foreign ministers at a summit in Canada. The top diplomats discussed the war in Ukraine, the ceasefire in Gaza, and recent violence in Sudan. Rubio says the U.S. is aware certain countries are supplying weapons to the paramilitary group RSF in Sudan, and says the U.S. is applying pressure to get them to stop.
Someone's giving them the money and someone's giving them the weapon, and it's coming through some country. And we know who they are, and we're going to talk to them about it and make them understand that it's going to reflect poorly on them, and it's going to reflect poorly on the world.
State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson Tommy Pigott is here for more on that. Tommy, thank you so much for coming on. I know the Sudanese ambassador has openly called out the United Arab Emirates for helping the RSF. The UAE denies backing them. Is that the country Secretary Rubio is referring to here? And if so, what's the administration doing to pressure them to stop the violence?
Well, as Secretary Rubio said, we're not going to get in the business of calling out specific countries at this point through the media or through a press conference, because we're looking for a positive outcome. We are seeing the images on the ground, the reports on the ground, and it's heartbreaking. It's horrifying. It needs to come to an end. It's something we are working on every single day with our Quad partners at the highest levels of government to get to a humanitarian truce, to get much needed aid in there to stop this crisis. That remains our focus. And as the Secretary said, we are communicating at the highest levels of government. We know who is supplying these weapons. That is being communicated. We're hoping for a positive outcome here to end this crisis and get aid into the people that need it.
Secretary Rubio says he's having conversations about supplying Ukraine with defensive weapons to protect their energy grid. He also says there need to be guarantees going into a potential high-level meeting with Russia. What kind of guarantees, and where do those talks stand right now?
Well, as the Secretary said, there was an agreement really between both sides to say the next time that the leaders meet, there needs to be a constructive, positive outcome out of this, something that's a deliverable. As the Secretary has said many, many times, we're not going to have meetings for the sake of meetings. We're going to have meetings that drive these issues forward and lead to results for the American people. That is when we're going to have these meetings. So the Secretary has been very clear on that. He's also been clear that we're in a position now where the Russians have made a demand that the Ukrainians cannot accept. That's where we are. We saw the recent sanctions announcement from President Trump. That's where we currently are. We want to see this war come to an end. We're ready to see this war come to an end. We're ready to have that meeting to bring this war to an end. That's been the consistent theme of this president. His singular focus when it comes to this conflict is ending this conflict, ending the bloodshed, and letting people go home, live prosperous lives, and be with their families.
Just this week, Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu said Israel's still at war with Hamas, despite the ceasefire and despite President Trump saying the war is effectively over. What do you make of Netanyahu's comments, and what's the latest on the efforts to launch an international stabilization force in Gaza?
Well, as the Secretary mentioned, we're in the process of drafting that now. We're in communication with our partners. Tremendous strides have been made in such a short period of time. No one is downplaying how complex this is. No one is downplaying the challenges. As Jared Kushner recently said, there are 10 things that we need to do all at once to make this happen, and we're working on those continually with our partners around the world. And I think it's always important to note the global coalition behind this effort, a global coalition that was only possible because of the leadership of President Trump. So tremendous strides have been made in a short period of time. We're continuing to work on this. We're continuing to communicate with our partners. Different countries have stepped up and are offering different things. We're in continual communication. We'll see how this goes, how this develops, but we're working on this every single day.
The U.S. is building up its military presence near South America. Tensions with Venezuela are rising. Why send the world's largest aircraft carrier to the Caribbean? And what are the administration's objectives when it comes to Venezuela?
Well, I think it's important to, again, recognize that we are engaged in a counter-narcotics operation, a counter-cartel operation against narco-terrorists. And there's a number I think is always important to keep in mind when we're talking about this issue, and that is 25,000. As the president has said, each one of those boats represents 25,000 Americans that could be poisoned by the drugs on that boat. This is part of a whole-of-government approach to stop the flow of deadly drugs into our country. Of course, we're seeing those actions against these drug boats, against these narco-terrorists, but it also includes security cooperation with our partners in the region, stopping illegal immigration, securing our border with the most secure border in history, and also agreements to address the precursors of fentanyl that are also part of this illicit trade. So we are committed. The single largest cause of death for Americans aged 18 to 45 are overdoses fueled by these illicit deadly drugs. The president has promised to stop the flow of these drugs into this country, and he's taking action to do just that.
So do you deny Nicolas Maduro's allegations that the president's just looking for regime change here?
Well, the president's addressed this, the secretary's addressed this. As the secretary just said yesterday, he is an illegitimate leader of a regime, an illegitimate regime in Venezuela. We don't spend time reacting to what he says. We're engaged in a counter-cartel, counter-narco-terrorist operation to stop the flow of these deadly drugs into our country.
And Catholic bishops in the U.S. just issued a rare statement rebuking the administration's immigration policies, including the State Department revoking visas from those they disagree with. The bishops say, and I'm quoting here, "We are saddened by the state of contemporary debate and the vilification of immigrants. We're concerned about the conditions in detention centers and the lack of access to pastoral care. We lament that some immigrants in the United States have arbitrarily lost their legal status." What's your response to that?
Under the previous administration, we saw the worst border crisis in U.S. history. And part of that was, of course, the border crossings that we saw, but also was an abuse of our immigration laws, an abuse of our immigration system that this president has brought to an end. And the result is the most secure border in U.S. history. We're seeing a number of zero of illegal border crossings in terms of people being released into the United States, something that many people thought was impossible. And we cannot overstate the negative consequences of the border crisis we saw under the previous administration. The crime that was a result, the dangerous route that people took to the border, the destabilization, of course, in the United States, but of all of these countries in the entire region. The cartels and narco-terrorists that took advantage of those illegal migration flows. Securing the border as a national security imperative, all of these steps are doing just that. And when it comes to visa revocations, an important thing to note here is that most of those visa revocations are due to direct violations of the law. DUIs, assault, and theft. We are not going to have foreigners here on visas that break our laws, that drive drunk on our streets, that assault our people, that steal from our stores. We are not going to allow that to happen. We have zero tolerance for foreigners in this country that break our laws.
All right, State Department Principal Deputy Spokesperson Tommy Pigott, we appreciate your time today, Tommy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me on.